We thought it was just another dead zone, another half-collapsed neighborhood the maps had already forgotten. It looked empty from the ridge, rows of crumbling buildings, broken windows, sun-scorched walls, and silence that pressed against your ears like a weight. Our orders were simple. Hold the position for 2 days, observe, and wait. There were no known threats, no recent activity. The last recon sweep had come back clean. But even as we moved in and set up inside a bombed-out 2-story admin building, something felt off. It wasn't fear. It was absence. Too much of it. The first shot didn't sound like a shot. It was quiet. Clean, like air being punctured. One of ours was heading to the edge of the compound, just to refill water from a stash we'd set earlier. He dropped mid-step, no scream, no stumble. Just gone, face down in the dust. We froze. Thought maybe it was a misstep, heat stroke, something stupid. Until the second one fell. He was dragging a crate across the hall when it happened. One moment he was breathing, sweating, muttering. The next his head snapped back with a wet crack, and he slumped sideways. Still no sound. No muzzle flash. Just death, silent and deliberate. We pulled back deeper into the structure, every window now a threat, every doorway a grave. The shots were too perfect, too patient. No panic, no spray. Just one. Then silence. Then one more. There was no pattern, no urgency. He wasn't in a hurry. He was watching, studying us like specimens behind glass. Every move became a gamble, every breath a potential giveaway. Hours passed, then more. We stopped counting time after the first night. Sleep was impossible. Even blinking felt dangerous. Shadows played tricks. Every flicker outside a window felt like the shape of a man, a scope, an eye. Some of us started whispering to ourselves. Some stared into nothing. The silence got inside us, crawled through our heads like insects. It wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the fear of not knowing when, or how, or from where. We never saw him, not once. Just the results of his presence. A body, a smear, a breath that stopped. We stopped trusting each other's directions. One man swore he saw movement on the roof. Another thought it was from the ridge. The truth? None of us knew. And the longer we stayed, the more that question became a weight in our lungs. Was it one sniper? Was it two? Was it even a person? We started calling it the shadow, not out of superstition, but because that's all we ever saw. Glimpses, flickers, the suggestion of something watching from the dark. By the end of the second day, the only thing we were sure of was that something was still out there. And it hadn't missed yet. Under a dull and cloudless sky, they approached the outskirts of the village in silence. The Humvee had dropped them off a kilometer back, the road ahead considered too unstable for vehicles, potentially rigged, possibly watched, and definitely forgotten by any real support. 6 of them moved across the terrain, boots crunching softly over sun-hardened earth, their silhouettes blending into the landscape scorched by years of fire, sand, and neglect. The ruins they headed toward were once government buildings, shops, maybe homes. Now, they were jagged outlines of memories, broken bones of a place that no longer existed on any map anyone trusted. Each structure stood with its walls torn open, windows gaping like hollow eyes. Nothing stirred. No birds, no voices, no animals. Just heat rising off cracked concrete and the occasional gust of dry wind that carried the smell of dust and old smoke. They were told it was a low-risk hold position. Intelligence had confirmed minimal presence. Perhaps some foot traffic, but no known cell activity. 2 days, tops. Sit tight, observe, report. No engagement, no sweeps. Just watch and wait. Their assigned structure was a 2-story administrative shell, long abandoned, with half the roof missing and scorch marks along the stairwell. They entered with caution, but no immediate sense of urgency. The kind of tension that soldiers wore even when told they didn't need to. The interior was stripped. Papers turned to mulch littered the floor, chairs without backs. A desk bolted to nothing. They checked every room, cleared the second floor, and marked fallback points. Reyes, who had done this more times than he could count, picked the rear hallway as his sleeping corner. Not too exposed, not too deep. The others spread out, assigning sectors for observation, logging entrance angles, and confirming ammo counts without needing to be told. Outside, the silence never changed. No distant calls to prayer. No chatter on civilian radios. Even the sky seemed muted, a faded dome of beige and gray with no birds crossing it. They established a routine quickly. 2 on watch, 2 resting, 1 patrolling, 1 rotating every 3 hours. Time passed in fragments, measured in the scuff of a boot, the static of a headset, the drip of sweat rolling into eyes. Their water rations were limited, the generator unreliable, and the sat-link for comms blinked more than it stayed lit. Still, none of it was out of the ordinary. They'd all been in worse conditions. It was a quiet op. Too quiet. By late afternoon, they had fortified the front of the compound with what they could. Stacked sandbags, debris reconfigured into barricades. 2 sight lines pointed toward the east and north where visibility was widest. They ate in near silence, tearing open ration packs with dusty fingers, their eyes fixed on the windows even as they chewed. The sun dropped quickly behind the ridge. Shadows lengthened like claws reaching across the compound floor. Inside, they dimmed their flashlights and moved quietly. No one laughed. No one told stories. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. The kind of instinct that whispers when something doesn't feel right, even if the facts say it should. That night, they slept in shifts. Reyes took the 0000 to 0300 post, stationed near a broken window on the 2nd floor, rifle resting on a sandbag. Scope trained on the edge of a half-destroyed warehouse 50 meters away. He watched as the wind tugged at a piece of torn plastic caught on rebar, listened to the faint creaks of metal expanding and contracting in the cooling air. Nothing moved, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. Not directly, not clearly, just something. At 0320, he saw a flicker. Not movement, not form, just a shift in the texture of the shadows behind a burned-out car near the outer fence. He blinked. Nothing. He adjusted his sight. Still nothing. He didn't wake the others. No sound. No confirmation. Just a twinge of doubt in his gut. When his shift ended, he told the next watch to keep an eye on the east wall. No alarm. Just caution. By sunrise, they had logged a full rotation. No shots fired. No enemy contact. Just the same eerie stillness that had settled on the compound the moment they arrived. It felt almost sacred in its absence, like even conflict had left this place behind. The commander checked in briefly over the comms, voice distant and staticky, confirming another team would be entering the region in 48 hours. Until then, they were alone. As the second day began, no one spoke about the strange quiet. They moved through their routine, checked and rechecked positions, counted rounds, recounted water, tightened straps, cleaned weapons. There was no enemy here, but the silence had begun to feel like one. They couldn't name it, couldn't see it, but it was watching. They could feel it. Under the relentless midday sun, the compound had settled into its 2nd day of stillness. The heat was a living thing, pressing down from above and radiating from the concrete beneath their boots. Sweat clung to skin like a second layer. The air itself shimmered with exhaustion, and the only sound was the occasional whisper over the radio, or the shifting creak of old metal warping in the heat. The 6 of them had fallen into rhythm. Quiet rotations, short bursts of alertness punctuated by longer stretches of waiting, watching, listening. Even in the silence, the landscape felt heavy with something unseen. The kind of weight that wraps around your lungs and slows your thoughts, not with tiredness, but with tension. The kind that creeps up your spine when everything is too quiet for too long. Mendoza was the first to step beyond the shadow line. He'd been sitting in the far stairwell for 2 hours, waiting out the heat, the buzz of flies and the static from the comms his only company. When he stood, it was to retrieve a jerrycan from their small water cache just outside the building, tucked behind a partially collapsed wall. He waved off Reyes's offer to cover him. Too quick, too routine. The sun had baked the area so thoroughly, it seemed impossible that anything could be waiting out there. He stepped into the light. The sound, when it came, was barely a sound at all. Not a crack or thunderclap, but something thinner, cleaner. A mechanical breath, a pop swallowed by distance. Reyes caught the motion before he heard it, a twitch of Mendoza's shoulder, then his legs folding beneath him like water spilling from a broken container. The jerrycan bounced once, rolled away slowly, stopped. Reyes didn't move. No one did. For a second too long it didn't register. The shape in the dirt wasn't Mendoza. It couldn't be. He'd just been moving, just there. Then the red started to spread. Everyone dropped at once. Movement ceased. Shadows peeled back into cover. Adrenaline snapped their muscles into position. Reyes crawled to the window, keeping low. scanning the far ridge, the rooftops, the alleyways. Nothing. No muzzle flash. No glint of light. No signature. No warning. Just Mendoza's body lying in the middle of a dead courtyard, motionless. Silence returned. But it was no longer empty. It was occupied now, held by something precise and invisible. They pulled back from all exposed positions, retreating into the central rooms, minimizing profiles, changing angles. The floor turned cold even under the heat. Reyes looked to Davis, who was already moving to the inner stairwell, checking lines of sight from the rear. No one spoke. Even their breathing slowed, as if too much movement might trigger something they couldn't see. Minutes passed. An hour, maybe more. Time lost shape. Reyes kept scanning through his scope, inch by inch across every rooftop, every window frame, every shadow. Nothing moved. Mendoza didn't twitch. The blood had stopped spreading. He wasn't breathing. They didn't need to confirm it. They knew. Then came the second shot. This one struck during the reset, when they were adjusting positions inside, thinking maybe they could risk pulling Mendoza's body in under cover. Davis had moved closest to the southern wall, near a broken slit in the concrete where a small mirror had been placed to extend the angle of view. He leaned slightly, barely exposing a shoulder and a sliver of his face. The shot came through the mirror. The glass shattered, and he fell backward with a choking sound, blood pumping from his neck. Reyes reached him in seconds, dragging him back behind the wall, pressing his hand into the wound. But the hole was too clean, too deep. The blood came too fast. Davis's legs kicked twice, then stopped. There was still no sound from the outside. No follow-up. No movement. Reyes sat there for several minutes, hands soaked, face blank, trying to understand what they were facing. This wasn't sporadic fire or random pot shots. This was deliberate, controlled. The shooter, whoever, whatever they were, had waited for the exact moment, the minimal exposure, and hit a mirror. A mirror. That wasn't luck. That was mastery. The fear that followed wasn't explosive. It didn't tear through the group in a panic. It seeped in, like water rising slowly, inch by inch. It filled the rooms, pooled in the corners. No one wanted to move. No one dared speak. They sat in silence, rifles gripped tightly, backs to walls, eyes scanning through glass that no longer offered safety. Outside, the sun began to dip. Long shadows returned, stretching across Mendoza's body like fingers reaching for what remained. Flies gathered. The wind shifted, and still they saw nothing. The shooter had become a ghost. No trace, no origin. He wasn't hunting them. He was watching, waiting. 2 clean kills, both under perfect conditions, with no retaliation. He didn't want to kill quickly. He wanted control, to see how long they could sit still, how long the silence would wear them down, how fast their discipline would unravel under the weight of knowing they could die with a breath. Reyes couldn't remember blinking. His eyes burned. He hadn't taken his finger off the trigger in hours. The rest of the team mirrored him, eyes wide, dry, unblinking, afraid to shift weight or even swallow too loudly. In that moment, they understood the new rules. There was no movement, no exposure, no assumptions, only stillness. And even that wasn't safe. Under the low, unmoving sky, the building they occupied had become a coffin with windows. After Davis fell, none of them spoke for hours. The loss didn't need to be confirmed out loud. The blood that soaked through Reyes's sleeves and the dull stillness of Davis's body had already spoken the truth. There was nothing left to do but adapt. Their world had shrunk to walls and shadows, to the angles that might protect them and the fractions of light that could betray them. They moved like ghosts within the structure, staying low, minimizing noise, learning how to breathe without sound. The sniper outside didn't fire again. He didn't need to. 2 was enough. The message was delivered. Reyes posted himself at the eastern window again, but didn't lean too far. He adjusted his position every few minutes, making sure no part of his rifle crossed the threshold of light. They couldn't risk even a sliver of movement. Whatever was out there had the patience of stone and the precision of something that had trained in this exact kind of hunt. And he was watching them, not to kill quickly, but to make them know they could be killed at any moment. That was the difference. It wasn't execution, it was demonstration. Inside, the air grew hotter despite the dusk outside. The heat built not from the sun, but from the pressure. Every man in the squad had begun to develop his own ritual to stay sane. Reyes tapped his foot once every 30 seconds. Nolson whispered prayers with his eyes closed. Grant just stared at the same bullet hole in the wall for 3 hours straight, without blinking. They rationed water down to drops, food to bites. No one was hungry. Their stomachs were too full of dread. Sleep was impossible. Their minds ran in loops, scanning the last known shot vectors, trying to recreate the impossible. Where he was, where he might be now, what angle he could see through, whether it was one man or two or none at all. And they were losing their minds. Together, even the light inside became an enemy. The glow of a watch face, the reflection from a lens, the glint of a ring. Everything had to be covered. Duct tape, fabric, dirt. They blacked out their optics when not in use. They sat in rooms dark as cellars, peering out into a landscape that hadn't shifted in 12 hours. The sniper didn't move, didn't reposition, didn't get impatient. He was either an expert or something else entirely. Something mechanical in thought, human only in form. Reyes began to wonder if the shooter even existed in the way they understood enemies. This wasn't warfare. It was siege, but not of a place, of minds. They couldn't retrieve Mendoza or Davis. Their bodies remained outside, exposed, beginning to decay under the sun and attention of flies. Every now and then, Reyes would glance out at them, trying to find some small detail, some shift, something to tell him that the sniper had moved. But nothing did. The bodies stayed still, their presence both horrifying and grounding. They were real. They had been alive, and now they served as warnings. The squad's commander tried once to make contact through radio, but the signal was dead. Not jammed, just absent. They suspected the antenna had been damaged, or that something in the surrounding ruins disrupted their outbound calls. The silence on the line only echoed the silence of the courtyard. It was complete. Perfect. Unnatural. By nightfall, they made the decision to split into pairs and alternate watch. 2 at the north side, 2 at the south, 2 resting, if you could call it that. Reyes stayed up. He couldn't sleep even if he wanted to. His heartbeat never slowed, never normalized. It existed as a constant thrum behind his eyes. He kept checking the same positions through the scope. Broken building at 2 o'clock. Vehicle husk at 9. Communications tower foundation beyond the ridge. No change. He imagined a man prone in the dirt, scope pressed to his eye, unmoving for hours, never blinking, never flinching, just watching them squirm. That night, one of the others had a breakdown. Nolson began muttering louder, scratching at his helmet as if trying to peel off layers of thought. They had to restrain him quietly, pull him away from the open sight lines, and keep him in the inner hall. He didn't scream, didn't lash out. He just unraveled. His lips moved, and he looked at each of them as though they were already dead and hadn't realized it yet. They considered moving under cover of darkness, but the sniper, or whatever was out there, had fired through a mirror. Darkness might be more of a risk than a shield. One spark from a boot on rubble, one reflection from an exposed magazine, one stumble into moonlight, and they'd be the next red stain on the wall. They stayed inside. By morning, none of them knew how long they had been there. The days blurred. The light never changed enough. Time became irrelevant. They began talking less, even when necessary. The silence inside now matched the silence outside. It was like breathing in a vacuum, a place where noise had no place and sound couldn't escape. At some point, Grant asked if maybe the sniper had left. He asked it without hope, only obligation. Reyes didn't answer. He just stared through the scope, back at the same distant ledge, watching the same bush that hadn't moved in a day, wondering whether it was just a bush, or something that had always been looking back. Under the faded light of late afternoon, the line between reality and imagination began to blur. The men had not slept in over 30 hours. Their bodies were still functioning, driven by adrenaline and instinct, but their minds had frayed around the edges. Hunger was secondary. Thirst was managed through rationing, but nothing could quench the dryness in their throats caused not by heat, but by fear. The sniper had not fired again. That silence, rather than comforting, had become a psychological vice. The stillness was not absence. It was presence. A calculated withholding. A message that he could strike again at any moment but chose not to. Not yet. Inside the compound, everything became a test. Movement from one side of the hallway to the other was an operation. Crawling was preferred to walking. Crossing a lit gap required coordination, double checks, shadows, and a covering position. Even though they all knew the covering position was mostly symbolic. No one could cover against a ghost. There was no direction to return fire. Just the waiting, the slow wear of second-guessing every motion. It was Grant who first proposed they test him. Not with weapons, not with firepower, but with bait. Not to shoot, just to see if he would bite. Reyes didn't like it, but he understood it. They needed information. Any information. They were breaking from the inside. And fear with no feedback was worse than a confirmed threat. So, they took a jacket, filled it with sand, and draped it over a broken chair. They placed it near one of the lower windows, where the light filtered through jagged glass and danced across the floor like water. A shadow puppet of a soldier. They waited 32 minutes. Nothing. Grant repositioned it slightly, exposed more of the shoulder, leaned it toward the light to simulate movement. 10 more minutes passed. Then, as if the sniper had grown tired of the ruse, the shot came. Clean, silent, instantaneous. The upper part of the chair disintegrated into splinters, the jacket shredded at the seam where the shoulder met the chest. The round tore through the stuffing and exited into the wall behind it, embedding itself with a dull thunk. The message was clear. He saw through it. He wasn't just aiming at movement. He was watching closely enough to know the difference. The man outside had the patience to wait, and the discernment to choose only targets that mattered. That meant he wasn't guessing. He was reading them. For Reyes, this was the confirmation that pushed the situation from fear into something colder. This wasn't a typical sniper. This was someone who had elevated the task into something more personal. Not just warfare, but psychological domination. And it worked. Every man in the building flinched after that shot. Not from the impact, but from the clarity. They had been watched through every breath, every micro-movement, every shift of posture. They were under the lens. Insects beneath glass. Paranoia deepened. Every sound inside the building now carried weight. The creak of a board. The scrape of a rifle stock. The clatter of a stone underfoot. Each sound felt like a flare. They began muffling every surface. Cloth over metal, tape over buckles, dirt in their pockets to silence loose items. They didn't speak unless absolutely necessary, and even then, only in whispers pressed to each other's ears. Some stopped speaking altogether. On the second night, someone knocked over a water bottle. The noise was sharp, unexpected. Everyone froze. Reyes counted the seconds. 1, 2, 10. Nothing. But the sniper had heard. He had to. Whether or not he responded didn't matter. The knowledge that he knew was enough to tighten every muscle in their bodies. By now, none of them trusted the compound. Not the walls. Not the glass. Not the shadows. The building was no longer shelter. It was a trap they had walked into willingly. A cage of false protection. Reyes began to imagine the sniper's scope moving from room to room, window to window, methodically memorizing the placement of their boots, the flash of a lens, the flick of a finger. Maybe he didn't shoot because he didn't need to anymore. They were already broken, already contained. Grant began sketching possible positions on a dirty notepad. Lines, distances, elevation. It was an exercise in control, but everyone knew it was a guess. The angles didn't make sense. Some of the shot vectors were impossible, unless he moved. But when? And how? The area was open. They had eyes on the perimeter at all times, yet there were no tracks, no sounds, no signal. Either he was invisible, or they were blind. The most terrifying thought came when Reyes realized they had started to imagine more than one. What if there were 2 or 3? One for each direction. The discipline of the shots, the silence, the reach. It didn't seem possible for one man. But what if it was? The questions never stopped. Is he watching now? Does he know I'm thinking of him? Is he tired? Is he smiling? When Reyes finally slept, it was in 5-minute flashes. Shallow, haunted sleep, more like absence than rest. He saw eyes in the dream, unblinking, unhuman, embedded in the horizon, watching. By morning, they weren't just hunted. They were studied, dissected, and they had nothing left but choices no one wanted to make. Under the gray blur of morning, with the compound sinking deeper into psychological exhaustion, the silence no longer felt like a passive force. It felt like pressure, like a living weight that wrapped itself around every breath, every thought. The sniper hadn't fired in hours, but his presence loomed larger than any bullet. The 6-man unit had become 4, and the remaining soldiers moved through the building like ghosts, unable to escape the invisible leash that kept them crouched, watching, afraid to even lean into light. The compound, once a shell of concrete and steel, had turned into a sensory prison, and the sniper was the warden with a scope instead of a key. For the first time in 2 days, there was talk, hushed and desperate, about taking a chance. Not escape, not combat, just movement. Anything to shift the equation. They couldn't wait anymore. Their supplies were almost gone. Their heads were filled with buzzing from dehydration and sleep deprivation. Eyes were dry, limbs trembling not with panic but from strain. The walls around them were stained with sweat, and the air inside had become stale and sour, like something rotting slowly in silence. The psychological edges of every man had been scraped raw, and Reyes knew that if they didn't move soon, they wouldn't need a sniper to take them out. They'd fall apart from the inside. The plan wasn't clean. It was desperate. They would set a distraction, something noisy, big, fast, a fire or an explosion, something that could draw the sniper's attention for even a few seconds. Enough for one man to make a break, draw fire, expose the shooter's position, or at least open an escape route for the others. No one volunteered. No one had to. Torres just stood. His silence spoke more than a briefing ever could. He knew what it meant, and so did everyone else. It wasn't heroism. It was necessity. Reyes gave him his second mag, shook his hand once, firmly, and the rest cleared space to the west stairwell. The distraction came in the form of a makeshift flare, an old fuel canister stuffed with cloth, set alight with the last of their field rations' fire gel. When the flame burst through the broken window frame and rolled smoke into the courtyard, Reyes held his breath, counting under it. At 4, Torres bolted through the lower hallway and out into the open. His form was low, tight, trained. Reyes watched from the top window, heart pounding against his ribs like it wanted out. The shot came on the 6th step. Clean, precise. But this time, not fatal. Torres went down, screaming. Not in pain, but in fury, dragging himself with one arm behind the burned-out water tank near the eastern wall. Reyes saw the spray of blood on the sand and the way his legs had stopped moving. But he was still alive, still screaming, still bait. It was enough. Reyes and Grant took the opportunity, sprinting from their position into the far corridor while the sniper readjusted. Nolson followed after a delay, tripping over a pile of debris but regaining his footing as they breached the back of the structure and dove into the exposed crawl space beneath the south platform. Dust filled their lungs. Their rifles scraped stone. No one fired back. They just ran. The plan wasn't perfect, but it worked. By the time they cleared the first street outside the compound, panting and crawling through the fractured urban maze, they realized the sniper hadn't followed. Reyes risked a glance back from behind a shattered wall and saw Torres still lying there, unmoving now. Blood congealed beneath him in a black stain that reached toward the shadowed corridor. The fire still burned nearby, casting distorted light over the courtyard like flickering ghosts. Still, no movement from the rooftops, no sound. The sniper hadn't left. He'd just let them go. Not because he couldn't shoot them, but because he didn't want to. The idea chilled Reyes more than any near-death experience had. The sniper had made his point, had demonstrated his power not just through kill shots, but through control. He had allowed a few of them to escape, not from mercy, but because that was part of the message. He could take them all. But he didn't need to. The fear would finish the job. They regrouped in an abandoned drainage tunnel half a kilometer out. No words, just breathing, just listening. Each of them had a new tremor in their hands. Not from the sprint, from what they'd left behind. The kind of silence that doesn't go away when you leave it. And Torres. He had given them the only window they were likely to get. Whether he was still alive, whether the sniper had finished him after they were gone, none of them knew, and none of them could bring themselves to speak his name. They waited in the dark for rescue. There was no signal. The radio crackled occasionally with static, but never with a voice. Time stretched again, but this time the waiting was different. It wasn't tense. It was hollow, as if something had been taken from each of them, something deeper than blood or pride. Reyes sat against the damp wall, staring into the black. His ears still rang with the memory of the shot. Not the sound of it, but the precision, the intent. The sniper had won, not by killing them, but by letting them live. They waited in that tunnel for what felt like years compressed into hours. The air was damp and heavy with mildew and the metallic sting of sweat-soaked gear. No one spoke. No one checked the time anymore. The The sound of their own breathing became the background noise they anchored themselves to, each inhale a silent confirmation that they had made it this far, though none of them were sure how or why. It wasn't survival in the triumphant sense. It was survival like drifting wreckage, unmoving, barely afloat, shaped by what had been taken away more than what remained. When the extraction finally arrived, it wasn't dramatic. No thunder of helicopters, no lights or shouting. Just a low, dusty convoy grinding toward them in the half-light of morning. A shape in the horizon haze, like something half-imagined but solid enough to believe in when they heard the tires. They climbed into the vehicle without ceremony. The doors slammed shut. The engine rumbled. Reyes sat with his back against the wall of the transport, staring at nothing, rifle across his lap, his uniform stiff with dried sweat and blood. Grant leaned forward with his hands folded between his knees, his eyes unfocused, as though he were still seeing something that hadn't ended. Knowlson hadn't said a word since they fled the compound. His silence now was different. It had shape and purpose. He stared out the tiny window slit, watching the landscape crawl past, the buildings bleeding into one another, all of it muted, lifeless, scorched beyond identity. No one asked what happened. The driver didn't turn around. There was no debrief, no analyst with a clipboard waiting at the next checkpoint. When they arrived at the forward base, they were checked for wounds, handed water, and left alone. They sat under the shade of a canvas tarp, the sun finally pressing through a yellow sky like it had just remembered its role. The noise of generators and boots and shouting from other units filled the air around them, but it didn't reach them. It bounced off, irrelevant. They were surrounded by life, but they remained untouched, locked in the echo of a silence that had followed them from that building. Eventually, Reyes walked to the edge of the base and stood near a perimeter fence where the horizon rolled flat into the dust. He watched it for a long time, not looking for anything, just staring, trying to see if there was something there that had followed him, a figure, a shape, a shimmer. But there was nothing, and still he felt the presence. Torres never made it back. Official reports listed him as KIA, killed in action, but no one retrieved his body. There was no photograph, no drone sweep, no confirmation. He became a ghost story told by men who no longer wanted to remember their own names, a name without a grave, a debt without closure. The intelligence community never confirmed the sniper's identity. The brief inquiry dismissed the incident as an unfortunate engagement under unclear battlefield conditions. The lack of evidence turned their trauma into rumor. One of the analysts joked, maybe it was a myth, a hallucination born from stress, that someone could wait that long, hit with such precision, remain unseen for 2 days? Unlikely, statistically improbable. Probably 2 shooters, maybe a disguised spotter team. Nothing special, but Reyes knew. He remembered the way the shot passed through the mirror, the way it had waited, the way it had let them go. That wasn't strategy. That was a game played by someone who didn't need credit or medals, someone who hunted for the sake of control, of power, a ghost in daylight, patient and surgical, who understood fear better than anyone they'd ever fought. The others scattered after the operation, reassigned, transferred, one put in for early discharge. Another vanished into a different unit, never answered comms again. They didn't talk about it. They couldn't. Not because it was too painful, but because no words fit. How do you describe being watched by something you never saw? How do you explain the feeling of being dissected, unpeeled from within by nothing more than silence and waiting? Reyes stayed. He moved to a logistics role after his tour, far from the front. He couldn't stand rooftops anymore. Or glass. Reflections made his skin crawl. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning, he would stare at the edges of his quarters, at the corners where the light met the dark, and feel the same presence. Not hostile, not aggressive, just observant. Measuring him, waiting. He never went back to that sector, never asked to, never read the follow-up reports. But in the deepest part of his mind, he knew the sniper was still out there. Not as a person, maybe not even in the same body, but as a force, a rule, a consequence for thinking any place was safe just because it was quiet. The others tried to forget. Reyes didn't. He carried the silence with him, not as a weight, but as a shape inside his bones. A reminder that the deadliest weapon on any battlefield wasn't a bullet. It was time, and someone who knew exactly how to use it.